So yes, as Steve said, this afternoon I am presenting the preliminary findings of a study by economist Wayne Weingarten, who is a senior fellow in business and economics here at PRI. I first met Wayne through Arthur Laffer, actually, about a decade ago. And Wayne and Arthur co-authored a book for PRI titled Eureka, How to Fix California. And as things are, we're still at it. So I got the inspiration for this study one morning when I was scrolling through my emails, going through all the dozens and dozens of articles. You get them all too. And the funny thing is that the articles that always attract my attention as a think tank wonk are these top 10 lists. And I always pour through them. You've all seen them. The top 10 best cities to retire, or one of my favorites, the 10 most beautiful beaches, or my real favorite here, the top 10 little towns to get away from it all. So I go through these lists, and for a few moments I imagine my life in these places. So this got me thinking, what makes for a great city? What makes for a great place to live? Which cities would end up in the top 10? Which would wind up at the bottom? Well, we all know the answer for what makes a great city. Good schools, thriving businesses, affordable housing, safe streets, good transportation, and a local government that operates efficiently. But for years now, all of these things have been deteriorating before our eyes, and as a result, we've seen a hollowing out of many of America's great cities. And while all of us understand the decline intuitively, it really takes an economist to quantify it, to measure it, to pinpoint what's happening. And so I turned to the best, Wayne Weingarten, and he ended up crunching these numbers for us. And as Steve says, unfortunately, he can't be with us today, so I have the great privilege of providing you with the preview of his preliminary findings. So I'll try to do justice to the study, and if you have complicated technical questions, I promise to take them directly to him. So, with our first slide, so why do vibrant cities, why are they important? So let me start with this. Why does it even matter? Well, if you take a look at this chart, you'll see the tiny smattering of red areas. The fact is, half of the world's economic growth in this century comes from just 1% of the land mass of the world. I'll say that again. Half of the world's economic growth in this century came from just 1% of the land mass of the world. So these tiny specks here on this chart, these are the cities on Earth that drive half of the world's GDP. So I can't think of a better way to illustrate why vibrant cities are so key to economic growth. So this table here shows the population gain and loss for the top 50 cities in the US in terms of population. And this is a universe of cities that Wayne included in his analysis. So you can see here 21 of the 50 cities have lost populations in the last 5 years. The bottom three are the usual suspects, Detroit, Baltimore, and San Francisco. But what's also disturbing is of the 21 cities losing population, 5 are located in California. So in addition to San Francisco, you'll see close behind San Jose, followed by Los Angeles, Long Beach, and even San Diego. So what do these declining population cities have in common? Well, for one, high tax rates. The declining cities had a top state and local marginal tax rate of 6.3% compared to 5.5% for growing cities. And if you look at state and local corporate income tax rates for declining cities, the rate was 8.1%, and for growth cities, 5.6%. Another thing that declining population cities have in common, high cost of living. So in terms of housing affordability in declining cities, the median household pays 60% of its household income toward housing versus 45% in growth cities. Now, this really shocked me because usually financial advisors say that you only should pay 25% of your income. So imagine that if you had $100,000 in income and you're paying 60,000 of that, that is backbreaking, frankly. And over the overall cost of living, Wayne measures this against San Francisco, which is the most expensive major city in the world. So declining cities have 2/3 the cost of living of San Francisco, while in growth cities, a little more than half. Another thing that declining population cities have in common is a tough business climate. So Wayne used 2 leading business indices to illustrate the cost of doing business in the US among the top 50 cities. So declining population cities had a score of 68, while growth cities scored 71. And of course, a tough business climate translates into poor job growth. Over a 5-year change in employment, declining cities saw a 2.2% job loss, while growth cities saw a nearly 5% job increase. And finally, declining population cities have more poverty than growing cities, 13.6% versus 10.37%. So in addition to the major factors that I just mentioned here, Wayne also looked at a number of other factors. In the category of individual average tax burden, which accounts for the sales, income, and property taxes for the average family, he looked into that too. He looked into regulations such as minimum wage, occupational licensing, workers' comp, and zoning regulations. And he looked at the quality of life issues such as violent crime, property crime, school performance, mean travel time from home to work, transportation infrastructure, and the quality of hospitals and health systems. And in terms of the business environment, Wayne included the business startup environment and the ease of doing business. And finally, of course, in addition to poverty, he looked at homelessness as a percent of population. So the final results, and I should just caution you that these rankings might be subject to change, but probably not. He's just doing his final checks. So drum roll. Oh, she's got it up already. So the top 5 cities are number 1, Fort Worth, number 2, Colorado Springs, number 3, Raleigh, North Carolina, 4th, Austin, and 5th, Jacksonville, Florida. At the bottom 10, and I'm sad to report that 6 and 10 are California cities. Los Angeles at the bottom, number 50, Oakland at 49, New York 48, Long Beach 47, San Francisco 46, San Jose 42, and Fresno at 41. So there wasn't a single California city in the top 25. The highest ranked is here in Sacramento at 33, and San Diego came at 36, and then Bakersfield at 39. And finally, in the next chart, Wayne plots out in the x-axis here the city ranking. So the left side has the highest ranking cities, and on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, population growth. So from the downward slope of the trend line here, there's a clear relationship between the cities that are highly ranked on the left side and the cities where populations are growing. And you're going to see some anomalies over there. And what's happening there on the red circle, these cities actually have a low ranking, but have growing populations. And that's because the neighboring cities ranked even lower. So this is a fine example here where in Sacramento, where while it's a low rank, many San Franciscans have moved over here in recent years. So in conclusion, I just want to end with something President Biden said in his State of the Union address last week. And to his credit, he did allude to the poor state of our cities. He said in the opening paragraphs of his speech, quote, "Once thriving cities and towns have become shadows of what they used to be." And he goes on to say, "And along the way, something else was lost, pride, the sense of self-worth." These are President Biden's words, and I respectfully disagree with the president here. It's not that Americans have lost pride in their cities or somehow even lost their sense of self-worth. And this study bears the facts. People are not fleeing their cities because they've lost pride in their city. They're fleeing because they have pride in themselves, and people find self-worth in their ability to provide for their families, to send their children to good schools, and let them play in safe streets. So people are in search of these basics, and if they can't find them, they're going to move somewhere else. And so I hope that throughout this conference we can offer new ideas, sow the seeds of a turnaround, and really begin to take back our cities. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ro. Our next panelist is Margie Stagmeyer, who has come all the way from Georgia to join us today. She's a real estate asset manager and investor with more than 25 years' experience creating value for her domestic and international clients. She's owned or managed more than 3,000 affordable apartment units, targeting large blighted apartment complexes near failing elementary schools. She's the founder and board chair of Stars C, a nonprofit providing affordable apartment community residents with education, wellness, and gardening programs proven to stabilize families and communities. She shares the story of one community's transformation in her new book, Blighted: People, Politics, and an American Housing Miracle. You can get an autographed copy of her book in the lobby right after the discussion. Please welcome Margie Stagmeyer.
Thank you, Stephen. So I think I have some slides. Yes. Margie, as Stephen said, I'm Margie Stagmeyer, and I'm a landlord. And I've owned and managed 3,000 units, as he said. In 2018, I purchased a large blighted apartment community in Atlanta. Does everyone know what blighted means? I'm surprised at some people that don't know that word. It's an apartment community that's boarded up and has high crime in an area where population is declining, typically. And I have probably made offers on 100 blighted apartment communities in Atlanta. 100% of the time, the school's failing. So when I purchased this property, I have been a big fan of the book Evicted, where Matthew Desmond won the Pulitzer Prize for following 8 families in Milwaukee living in squalid housing conditions. So I decided to start documenting my property, Summerdale, and it has morphed into a book. So what the property does is it actually follows 15 people as I renovate this property, and it shows you the intersection between housing, education, and healthcare, and why we are raising the next generation of poverty through housing. So here is Summerdale Apartments. It's 244 units. Isn't it pretty? Believe it or not, I have a wait list now of people wanting to move into this property. Can we go to the next slide? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Cleveland Avenue, which is just north of the airport. It's like 3 miles from the city and about 3 miles from the Atlanta airport, the busiest in the world. This is the demographics when we purchased this property. So between 2000 and 2015, the population actually went down 12%. It's almost impossible in Atlanta. I mean, I've never heard of a little area having a population decline. Our average household income was $26,942, and about 2/3 of the families rented versus owned housing. Next slide. So here's our school, Cleveland Avenue Elementary. It was 1 block from the property. It has a mobility rate of 43%. Anyone know what that is? So transiency is what causes schools to fail. Every time a child moves, they lose 3 months of education. It's a crisis in Hidden Sight right now. But if you're losing 43% of your students every year, your school is not going to thrive. It got a rating of a D by the Georgia Governor's Department of Education. 27% of their students were not at reading level when they entered the 3rd grade. Everyone knows what that means. That's how you build prisons, by reading level at the 3rd grade. Seriously, that's how they forecast prison construction in Georgia. Next slide. So here's our crime activity. When we purchased the property the year before, they had 449 11 calls, of which 275 were for violent crime. A lot of gunfire. The property was controlled by a regional drug hub. So it was very unsafe to be there. Next slide. Here's cost of municipal services. The property contributed $28,000 a year in property taxes. It consumed over $1 million in municipal services. So as you can imagine, the city of Atlanta does not like these properties, and it wants them shut down. It's very hard to get permitting to renovate them. Next slide. So what we do is we buy properties like this. We have to put together a very innovative capital stack. In this particular property, I had to raise $10 million. I was able to do it at a cost of just under 3%, which enabled us to keep our rents at about $730 a month, which I know in California is a dream rent. But families earning roughly $26,000 a year, or the property rents were scaled for the demographics. And what we do is we purchase them. We have to work with the Atlanta Police Department and have very intense security for at least the first 3 months while we clean up the crime. Then we start the renovation. We partner with the school. We sign a memo of understanding with Atlanta Public Schools, and we put in wraparound services. And so these are some examples of things that we've done since we purchased the property. We have Cub Scouts at all our properties. We did a rental assistance eviction relief. We partner with the local federally qualified health clinic. In this particular case, it's Morehouse Medical. We have literacy, mental health, back-to-school wellness. Next slide. This is something we did in 2019, right before the pandemic. We built a playground in partnership with Kaboom. How many of y'all have heard of Kaboom? Because what we found is a lot of these children were so traumatized by the drug activity, they would literally walk through it from school to home, but they would never go outside and play. They didn't have a play space. And that's so important to mental health. So we now have a beautiful Kaboom. And I love this because if you can really see the photo, we had our school superintendent, we had councilmen there, we had judges there. It was just a great turnout. We had over 250 volunteers, and the kids designed the playground. Next slide, please. So here's our crime today. We actually are down 96% since we purchased the property. And these are COVID numbers. I'm trying to get 2022. Next slide. Our rents, so we had to go through the permitting process with the city of Atlanta, which delayed us 18 months and added $1.8 million to the process. So our rents didn't end up at $730. They actually ended up at $896, which doesn't sound like much, but every time you raise rents $100, homelessness goes up 15%. Next slide. So I was invited to speak to the Kansas State healthcare workers last September, and I'm thinking, what do public healthcare workers want to hear from a landlord? You know, that's my space. So my partner and I Googled housing and healthcare, and what we found out is the social determinants of health. How many of y'all have heard of this? A lot of people. I have never heard of this. And what we found is we're actually addressing all 6 of them through our model. So we were declared public health care workers by the state of Kansas, and we just applied for an National Institute of Health grant to study our model for 10 years. All right, next slide. So here's Summerdale today. It is completely renovated. I'm really excited because the 2 children at the bottom are actually now in the gifted program at Cleveland Avenue Elementary. Our students outperform their peers on the standardized test, and the families are all thriving. I have a wait list, and the whole area is starting to really improve from a crime perspective. Next slide. So one of the reasons I wrote this book is to really understand my model better, but to also use it as to introduce policymakers to the, quote, them, the people that are actually living in these apartments. And as I said, the book is about their stories, a little bit about mine, but it's really when you read about the day-to-day life of our principal, it occurred to me most of her challenges are caused by our housing. When you read about the traumatized children, we had 68 children, there's no hope. In the book, I'm following the Humphreys family. There's 4 generations that have lived at this property for 20 years, and you can just see down through the generations how it's just, the poverty just goes down the generations, and it's getting worse. It's mainly caused by the structural environment. So this is how the structural and built environment intersect. You have housing, and of course, then you have the legal environment, which affects housing, the regulatory environment, the capital markets, which are really important. I have to raise the money to be able to do this, and then the social human environment. Next slide, please. And this is how policy affected us. So we were able to raise the money at 2.9%. Yay! That enabled us to keep our rents at $730, but then we hit the regulatory environment, which forced us to raise our rents $166 a month. And it's all documented in the book. And then every time you raise rents over $100, homelessness goes up 15%. What costs a city roughly $35,000 a year in homeless or municipal costs to deal with homelessness. And every time a family becomes homeless, well, you're building transiency in the school. And it's roughly $6,800 per year to deal with a student as they move. And of course, they're not at third grade reading level, so you have to, eventually they'll end up in prison. There's a very high incident in prison for students that can't read. That's 23,000 a year in Georgia. And then finally, the eviction moratorium. I've been working with the City of Atlanta and the Chief Magistrate Court Judge to get her resources, but we figured the cost of the eviction moratorium costs the City of Atlanta over $60 million in property taxes lost. So you can see how just not having stable housing, how the cycle continues. And I think that's it. Next slide. Oh, one more slide. And I'm telling you why this is important. This is per the US Census, the number of permits issued to apartment communities over 5 units. You can see that less than half of our apartment stock is newer than 30 years. This is here to stay. I mean, I can show you hundreds of pictures of properties that are blighted around the country right now. I mean, thousands of them. So this is a big issue in a lot of municipalities, and it's only going to get worse as the housing inventory ages. I tell people housing is a crop. It has a shelf life. And a lot of municipalities and fire marshals don't have a method for dealing with legacy apartments because they were built in the 60s and 70s under different codes. There is no code to address this. Next slide. Yeah, here's some examples of one in Atlanta that I'd love to buy. Next slide. I think that's it. Is that it? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Margie. Our next panelist is the Honorable Steve McShane, who brings with him a unique perspective. For 15 years, he was the owner and general manager of McShane's Nursery and Landscape Supply, and he is also a third-term Salinas City Council member with 20 years of public sector experience. So he is also the chair of the Monterey Bay Air Resources District, the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, and the Central Coast Community Energy. He serves on the board of the California State Van Pool Authority, the Monterey Bay Marine Sanctuary, and the local Cal Poly Alumni Association, and yet he still has time to join us here. Please welcome Steve McShane.
Well, it's great to be here. Ronald Reagan famously said, "Strong businesses fuel strong communities," and I'm so proud of my role with the Chamber of Commerce. In fact, here in Sacramento, we have over 1,000 executives from all over the West, just down the street, so that's why it works so well. And I look at my friend Tim Anaya because we worked together in the Capitol when I was with Bruce McPherson, and prior to that as a Wilson appointee, back when Lance Azumi had hair and a different bow tie, we were appointees to a commission. So got started early. I'll just say there's a few things, just as background. This is such a relevant topic. Blight and homelessness really pair together. And in my time, say 20 years in public policy and local government, I've seen both increase. And there's a lot of different solutions. And in the next few moments, I'll walk through some of the things we've done in the city of Salinas. So as a council member, our city's 20 square miles. We have a $200 million budget. We're about the 18th or 19th largest city in the state. And we have the highest percent of undocumented for any county in the United States. It's crazy how many folks really in our community are working very hard in agriculture, off the grid in many respects, and to some extent contributing, and to some extent causing a lot of social challenges that we're working on. Some observations that I'll just make. Our city has about half of the homeless population in our county. There's about 4,000 in Monterey County homeless of a population of 450,000, and we've got well over 2,000, and it's been a growing challenge. I would say that in our city, we've taken the vast responsibility of those homeless. The county not doing its job, and as local school boards and local government have changed, certainly our council has gone way progressive. A mayor ago, it was a retired police detective that during council meetings would say, "That's enough, take a seat." Whereas, say, the current administration, and more importantly, the current makeup of the council include, a couple folks living at home, one that's still at the University of California, unemployed maybe. There's just the makeup of our council has fueled a diverse opinion base, which isn't necessarily bad, but I would say that from a guy's standpoint that really values public safety and infrastructure, we're spending more than ever on social services, particularly homelessness and blight. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I've been able to do. And I want to bring up a shining example because I do believe some of the policies we've introduced in the last 5 years have really worked well. And this is the front door, if you will, to a building that was abandoned and blighted. It's the Dick Bruin building, and we'll go to the next slide. You can see there, this is prior. The photos aren't perfect, but that's a hole in the roof in the lower right. And then right above it, all burned out. It was a 4-alarm fire that actually happened 5 years ago today. And it sat right in the heart of our downtown. Let's talk about after. Thanks to adaptive reuse, incentives, and ultimately a blight ordinance that we put in place, we were able to bring about 19 units, some of which are affordable, and 5 retail spaces on the bottom floor. Also, we'll go to the next slide. In addition to ushering in commercial blight, which is where my interest and reason for bringing policy forward at the council level, there was a bunch of issues with residential blight. So we were able to bring a lot more teeth, and you can see some before and after, and we'll keep going through those, Tim. Take a look at the next 20 properties that have fallen into this category where code enforcement, given more teeth, we're able to address some of the major issues. So before and after, that's a terrific one in North Salinas. Keep going, Tim. Yeah, lots and lots of safety issues. And this one in particular is a featured property that was in my district that was a real big problem on Lorimer. Go ahead again there, Tim. I can't tell you how many calls I had on this property. And the after there ultimately resulted in an ADU and a fully renovated unit. So let's keep going even more. Adaptive reuse are incentives, a fast track through permitting with reduced fees. In the case of this building, abandoned, and now it's home to 53 units and a really cool tap room on the bottom floor. You can see the units in the lower right-hand corner. This has helped a lot. And this sort of model to convert buildings like the one on the far left there, that at one time, say had different purposes and banking and so forth can provide housing. So those are just some examples. And I would just say more tools in the toolbox at local government are very important, and more incentives. And I would also say, as we talked about, and I think the book referenced, and even in some of Margie's projects, there's all of these wraparound services that are needed. The state of California is literally throwing money at local government to bring about some solution to homelessness. Of our population in 5 years, we've been able to house 10%. And that's a success, but it's at a tremendous cost. We've converted hotel rooms and hotel complexes. And in the case of some funding, the Fed's saying, hey, buy up properties and give people a place to live. There's a whole ideological conversation there. We debate it whenever we get together for council. But with the right policies, enforcement on overnight parking, with the right incentives for the private sector to take abandoned or blighted properties, invest, and have it pencil out, it works. One of the biggest incentives of all, I think, was pointed out in the slide, where permitting can come in. Permit relief for the right projects, terrific. And a fast track. When you send a project back to go through another hurdle or step, time is money. And really changing the culture in our permitting and planning departments so that they don't hold those projects up, have gone a long way. So that's kind of an introduction to where Salinas, California is at. I look forward to any questions and some more discussion. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Steve. Just checking our time here. I've got a couple quick questions. We got about 15 minutes, and then we'll go to the audience here. I want to start with you, Ro. People are fleeing San Francisco for Fresno and inland California places that wouldn't typically be viewed as premier locations. I'm not criticizing those cities. It's just they're not the prime choice. So why are I've noticed in San Francisco that we've had a pushback. I mean, they recalled the progressive DA. Residents there recalled their kind of loony school board members. Do you think there's hope? Does that give you hope? Do you, based on the data you saw in the study, do you think maybe San Francisco could be a model for moderation? No. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, or maybe just pass the mic. Or, however we want to do it.
No, unfortunately, Steve, I am a fugitive of San Francisco. I left San Francisco about 4 or 5 years ago. And while, as you say, the city has taken some steps, they've recalled their 3 school board members and their DA. I think the city's got a long way to go. In Wayne's scoring here, San Francisco does poorly in so many areas, including housing, their tax system, their business climate. So the city's got a long way to go, but there are very wealthy people in that city, and they're there as long as they can continue to live there. But unfortunately, the city has still got to see a lot more pain before they do anything.
So more on the gloom than the hopeful scale.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Margie, quick question. I haven't read your book yet, but I will. Is it a nonprofit model?
No, we're a for-profit model.
Okay, that's a really cool thing. But maybe could you quickly address that element of it?
So when we did our research, my partners and I really talked a long time, about a year, about whether we should be for-profit or nonprofit. Where foundations invest in housing, it's number 12 on their list. As a nonprofit, you're just not supported financially. So we decided that we had to go to a for-profit, but we started a nonprofit that does the wraparound services for fair housing laws. Because under fair housing, I can't, as a landlord, ask my tenants about education, health care. We started a nonprofit to buffer us. So we were a hybrid model.
Oh, okay. Before I forget, I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with bad tenants?
Patiently.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have 20 tenants under eviction right now, mainly because they work but refuse to pay rent. And we've done everything we can possibly do to help them get rental assistance, but some tenants just won't fill out the paperwork. And as I tell people that can get hostile with me about that, if you get evicted from our properties, you've really earned it. It's hard to get evicted from our properties, but we've helped a lot of tenants get jobs. A lot of tenants have gone into homeownership in my career. So.
Okay, great. And Steve, you said a couple things that raised my hackles. So you said that you want to give cities more tools, and you want to expedite the approvals for the right project. So having covered redevelopment agencies who are thankfully gone, I thank Jerry Brown for that. And maybe not for the right reasons, but he got rid of them in 2012. What I saw in covering it as a newspaper writer was that they would use a blight designation. My former city of Diamond Bar, they found peeling paint. Any excuse serves a tyrant. Any excuse serves a redevelopment agency. So how do you get at that? How do you get at giving cities more tools without having them ultimately abusing property rights through eminent domain to build the right projects, which often means the subsidized projects proposed by the politically powerful developers who may or may not be donating to city council campaigns?
Yeah, sure. So private property rights needed to be preserved in this policy. Like, that was first and foremost. So the city attorney and I worked really closely on this. What we were able to do is qualify a whole host of new nuisances. We know who the bad performers are. We know the properties that have been abandoned. Now we had a expedited process to document and make contact and ultimately take control if we had to. That even involves like cutting the grass even repairs if needed, and passing those on to expedite and flag and ultimately move these properties on. Now, when we narrowed down the list, there was maybe 20 commercial properties. 4 have gone through, 1 has been permitted and been resolved, and we've taken care of around 20 of our residential properties. We reckon there's another 100 or so. These are really bad, hazardous properties that have sat vacant for a long time. I think one thing that I would say as well is all of a sudden we elevated this as a huge problem. You know, cities have far too many things to do. It's like a million blinking lights at once. And if you have a council headed in all these different directions, it doesn't help the situation either. What we were able to do is elevate this and, quite frankly, you know, scare some folks and say, hey, there's a responsibility here to the neighborhood. And so far, it's worked. You know, I would also say that there are a lot of policymakers out there, a growing number, that want to tighten the noose, that want to loosen private property rights. And you know, that debate continues. You know, in our own city right now, it's rent control and it's rent registry. And I think in Los Angeles, one of the Board of Supervisors in the last week has introduced a policy to enact a moratorium on any evictions at all in LA County. So stuff like this just freezes the private sector, and it moves investment to states like Georgia, and you know, in places where, quite frankly, there may not even be as great a need as there is in California. So, you know, doesn't mean that the business sector can't be the tail that wags the dog, and that's where our Chamber of Commerce comes in. That's where we take strong positions. That's where any Chamber of Commerce in any communities and organizations like PRI comes in to move the dial. I mean, we need to turn the heat up on this and explain, hey, it's data, not narrative. I mean, it's exactly what the book and what Wayne's work is based on. Data, please. I could go on and on. Thank you.
Okay, well, let me see if, do we have any questions out there? Laura?
So a question for Steve. The Howard Jarvis people are not going to like me for this question, but under Prop 13, commercial properties are also covered. And one of the things that I found where I live, San Francisco and Marin County, they're properties that are ripe location-wise and everything else for redevelopment, and they don't get redeveloped because the mortgages have been long paid off and the property taxes are locked at decades-old levels. And so the owners have zero incentive, really, to do anything with the property. Most egregious is one example in San Francisco, Bus Vans for Bargains. It's almost a whole city square block. It's been vacant for 20 years for this exact reason.
So in our city, government-funded housing is costing anywhere from $700,000 to $1 million a unit. The private sector can do it cheaper and faster under most circumstances. I think incentives are the tool. I'm the founder of the Salinas Taxpayers Association, and I stand with Prop 13. I think, you know, it's got its sad, challenging side effects, and you're pointing to probably dozens of properties in the city of San Francisco and even in our city where it's not there. You need to get people excited. Our downtown was ghetto. When I ran a state assembly race in 2000 for Jeff Denham, we were on the 100 block. I was propositioned every day. And I was happy to say I had a girlfriend, right? And downtown, which is in my district, needed 50 stakeholder meetings, ultimately some government funding, 10 million to be exact, that ushered in over 100 million that's been invested in the last 5 years. We have a vibrant downtown. It is safe and it is awesome. And so it's that kind of attention. And I'll tell you how we did it. Because some of the folks in this room may own property in another part of the state that they haven't seen in 6 months or 6 years. That was our downtown. Folks that had moved away, second, third generation. What we did is we enacted a property-based improvement district. So folks that owned property were all of a sudden in control of where their property taxes went. We invited property owners to the table to make decisions on, do we spend more money on safety and less on infrastructure? And that sort of ownership really, really moved things. Folks that I knew and called on as a council member that were either elderly or disinterested, all of a sudden they were more interested. And their friends, at the country club or the Sutter Club for that matter, were like, hey, we could do this or we could do that. And then they were raising money, and this 72-foot, 35,000-pound arch gets dropped in the middle of this 200 blocks that says Salinas. So, there's some things to be said about ways that the government can incentivize that private investment. And I think we've got a shining example, and it hits a lot of the touch points that Governor Newsom would get excited about, right? Transit-oriented, walkable, low carbon footprint, all of these sorts of things. And it's the private sector driving this. So, government's got to get out of the way and bring about more Margies and get her a cape and a telephone booth.
I probably don't need this microphone, but this is for Margaret. So could you tell us what the steps you took to reduce crime in your blighted apartment complex that you acquired? Because I assume that the police could come by and chase away some criminals. They'd be back the next day. So were there routine patrols that you paid for, or were the criminals tenants that you evicted? So I'd like to hear the major steps you took to reduce crime around your complex.
So I've done this at probably 20 plus properties, and it's a predictable sequence. You have to have licensed, armed police officers, and you have to have them for 3 months, and you have to budget it. It's very expensive. You have to fix the infrastructure around the property. So I go into great detail in the book. Officer Ski was our police officer, and it was every night he got called 3 and 4 times to the property. He'd go in, make it, write a report and leave. He couldn't do it by himself. So just fixing the gates cut our crime, the regional drug business, just fixing the infrastructure. We installed 3 24/7 cameras that were monitored by downtown at the police department. So you have to invest the money. And even then, it still took us about 2 years to get rid of the crime because it was such a lucrative market. We finally would get the main guy locked up. He'd usually be back at the property within 24 hours, and we just kept at it. But once he was finally gone, we had when you say that you cannot come back, we had a restraining order against him. The next wave came in to basically take over the hub. So you just have to really stay at it. But after about 18 months, they finally got the hint. And even, just one more quick thing, we got a call this week, our property's getting marked by gangs. So we're now having to fight it off again. So it's constant vigilance.
Great. Well, thank you. That was a great panel. And